"Mama," Ruby whispered from the plastic chair behind the vending machines. "If someone loses money and nobody comes back for it, is it still wrong to keep it?" Marla Johnson stopped with one hand wrapped around the handle of her mop. For a moment, the whole Cleveland bus station seemed to grow quiet around that little question. Outside, January rain tapped against the tall windows like tired fingers. Inside, the last passengers of the night moved through the terminal, with their coats pulled tight and their faces turned down. Fluorescent lights hummed above the empty rows of seats. Somewhere near Gate 4, a vending machine rattled and dropped a bag of chips into the metal tray. Marla looked at her daughter. Ruby was only 6 years old, small for her age, with deep brown eyes that watched the world too carefully. Her prink winter coat had been washed so many times that the sleeves had turned pale at the edges. Beside her chair sat a little purple backpack, with a half-used inhaler tucked safely in the front pocket. Marla knew why Ruby had asked. On the floor near Platform 7, half hidden beneath a bench, lay a brown leather wallet. It was old, not fancy. Not the kind of wallet a rich man pulled from the pocket of a tailored coat. But it was thick enough to make a tired woman notice. And Marla was tired. She was 31 years old, though some mornings the mirror made her look closer to 40. She worked the late cleaning shift at the terminal from 6 in the evening until 2 in the morning. Before that, she spent 5 hours washing sheets at a budget motel off Lorraine Avenue. Between both jobs, she paid rent on a small apartment with a stove that clicked before it lit, bought groceries one careful list at a time, and kept Ruby's breathing medicine in the cabinet like it was gold. That morning, a yellow notice had been taped to her apartment door. 3 days late, that was all it said. 3 days late, as if 3 days could explain a whole life. Marla had folded the notice and put it in her coat pocket without crying. She did not cry in hallways. She did not cry in front of landlords. And she never cried in front of Ruby unless she could not stop it. Now Ruby's question hung in the air between them. Marla walked slowly to Platform 7. Her shoes made soft squeaking sounds on the wet floor. She bent down, picked up the wallet, and held it in her gloved hand. It would have been easy not to open it. It would have been easier to open it. Behind the ticket counter, someone laughed at something on a phone. Near the far doors, a man slept with his chin against his chest. The security guard had gone outside for a smoke. Nobody was watching Marla Johnson. Nobody but her little girl. Marla turned the wallet over once. Then again, the leather was worn smooth at the corners. There was no name stamped on the outside, no initials. Nothing to tell her whether the person who lost it was kind, careless, rich, poor, grateful, or cruel. Ruby slid down from her chair and came closer. "Mama?" she asked. Marla opened the wallet. Inside were $47 in cash, a faded driver's license, 2 folded receipts, a Medicare card, and a photograph of an elderly white woman standing in a rose garden. The picture had been touched so many times that the edges had gone soft. Then Marla found the note. It was tucked behind the photograph, written in shaky blue ink on a piece of paper folded into a small square. Marla read it once, then she read it again. "If I forget where I am, please call my daughter." Below the sentence was a phone number. Under the number, in smaller writing, was a name, Arthur Bell. Marla felt something tighten in her chest. This was not just a lost wallet. This was a man trying not to disappear. Ruby looked up at her. "Is there money in it?" "Yes," Marla said softly. "Are we going to turn it in?" Marla closed the wallet and slipped it into her coat pocket. Then she knelt so her eyes were level with Ruby's. "Baby," she said, brushing a loose curl away from her daughter's forehead. "Being tired doesn't give us permission to become somebody we wouldn't trust." Ruby looked down at her little boots. "But what if we need help too?" Marla's throat tightened. She wanted to say something wise, something easy, something that made poverty sound noble and honest choices feel painless. But Marla did not believe in lying to children just because the truth was heavy. So she said, "Then we ask for help the right way, and we keep our hands clean while we wait." Ruby nodded, though she did not fully understand. Marla stood and looked at the driver's license again. Arthur Bell, 78 years old. Gray hair, pale blue eyes, a tired smile that seemed to belong to a man who had once been less alone. She turned toward the lost and found office. Then she stopped. Across the terminal near Gate 12, an old man stood frozen beneath the departure board. He wore a brown overcoat, one button missing, and a navy scarf tucked unevenly at his throat. His white hair was combed neatly, but his face was full of panic. He looked at the flashing bus times as if they were written in a language he longer understood. A boarding call echoed through the terminal. "Final call for Columbus, Gate 12. The old man stepped forward. Marla's heart dropped. She looked at the wallet in her hand, then at the note, then at the old man reaching for the wrong door. "Ruby," Marla said quickly. "Stay right here." But Ruby was already grabbing her backpack. "Mama, is that him?" Marla did not answer. She was already running. "Sir, wait!" Marla's voice cut through the hollow noise of the Cleveland terminal just as Arthur Bell placed one trembling hand on the glass door leading to Gate 12. The driver outside had already opened the luggage compartment. A few tired passengers were stepping into the cold rain, their bags bumping against their knees. The bus to Columbus sat under the yellow station lights, its engine coughing white smoke into the night. Arthur turned halfway around. His pale blue eyes searched Marla's face with the frightened politeness of a man who knew he should recognize something, but could not find the place in his mind where that knowing belonged. "I'm sorry," he said. "Do I know you?" Marla slowed before she reached him. She had learned from years of working around strangers at their worst hours that panic could grow sharper if you rushed toward it. She held both hands where he could see them. "My name is Marla Johnson," she said gently. "I work here at the station." Arthur looked toward her uniform, then toward the bus door. "I have to get on," he said. "My wife is waiting." The words landed softly, but Marla felt the ache inside them. Behind her, Ruby had followed despite being told to stay. She stood several steps away, clutching the strap of her purple backpack, watching with wide, worried eyes. Marla reached slowly into her coat pocket and pulled out the brown leather wallet. "I think this belongs to you, Mr. Bell." Arthur looked at the wallet. For 1 second his face cleared, then it clouded again. "I lost that? Yes, sir." He touched his coat pocket, then another, then the inside of his jacket. His hands began to shake harder. "Oh," he whispered. "Oh, I must have. I don't usually." "It's all right," Marla said. "Everything is still inside." Arthur took the wallet but did not open it. He stared at it as if it might explain how he had arrived at this moment, under this harsh light, with strangers passing around him like water around a stone. The bus driver called from outside, "Sir, you coming or not?" Arthur flinched. Marla turned her head just enough to answer. "He needs a minute." The driver sighed, but he said nothing more. Arthur looked at the bus again. "Is this the bus to Dayton?" "No, sir," Marla said carefully. "This one is going to Columbus." He blinked. "Columbus?" "Yes." His mouth tightened. He looked embarrassed before he looked afraid. That broke Marla's heart more than the fear did. Older people often carried their dignity like a fragile cup. Once it cracked, they tried to hide the pieces. Arthur lowered his voice. "I was sure it was Dayton." Marla did not correct him too quickly. She did not say, "You were wrong." She did not say, "You almost got on the wrong bus." She simply stepped closer and said, "These boards can be confusing at night. Happens to a lot of people." Arthur nodded, grateful for the mercy of that small kindness. Ruby came to Marla's side then. "Mama," she whispered, "is he okay?" Arthur looked down at the little girl. Something in his expression softened. "Well," he said with an effortful smile, "I appear to have misplaced more than my wallet." Ruby did not laugh. She studied him with the solemn kindness only children sometimes have. "My mama finds things," she said. Arthur looked at Marla. "That is a useful gift," he said. Marla opened the wallet just enough to show him the folded note tucked behind the photograph. "Mr. Bell, there's a phone number in here. Would it be all right if I called your daughter?" His face changed immediately, not anger, not refusal, shame. He closed his eyes for a moment. "I don't want to trouble Helen. If Ruby was lost," Marla said, keeping her voice low, "I would pray somebody troubled me." Arthur opened his eyes. The station seemed colder then. Rain tapped harder against the windows. A woman at the ticket counter argued about a refund. Someone dragged a suitcase with a broken wheel across the tiles. Ordinary life kept moving, careless and loud, while Arthur Bell stood at the edge of a mistake that might have carried him far from anyone who knew his name. At last he nodded. Marla guided him away from the gate and toward the row of seats near the vending machines. Ruby walked on his other side without being asked, as if her small presence could help keep him steady. When Arthur sat down, he held the wallet in both hands. Marla took out her phone. The screen showed 12% battery. She silently prayed it would last. The number rang 4 times. A woman answered sharply. "Hello? Is this Helen Bell?" A pause. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Marla Johnson. I work at the Cleveland bus station. I'm here with your father." Arthur Bell. The silence on the other end changed shape. "My father," Helen said. "Where exactly is he?" "At the terminal downtown. He's safe." "What do you mean safe?" Marla looked at Arthur. He was staring at the photograph of his wife now, his thumb brushing the woman's face. "He lost his wallet," Marla said. "I found it. Then I found him near the wrong gate. I think he may have gotten confused." Helen inhaled quickly. I told him not to travel alone, she said, more to herself than to Marla. I told him. Arthur's shoulders tightened. He had heard enough to understand he was being discussed. Marla turned slightly away to protect him from the full weight of the conversation. He's sitting down, she said. He has his wallet. Nothing is missing. I can stay with him until you get here. Another pause. Then Helen's voice came colder. Nothing is missing? Marla understood the question beneath the question. She had heard that tone before. In stores. In apartment offices. At service counters where people looked at her uniform before they looked at her face. No, Mom, Marla said evenly. Nothing is missing. I'm 20 minutes away, Helen said. Please don't let him leave. The call ended. Marla lowered the phone. Ruby looked up at her. Is his daughter coming? Yes! Was she nice? Marla glanced toward Arthur, then slipped her phone back into her pocket. She was scared, Marla said. Sometimes scared people forget to be nice. Arthur folded the photograph and returned it to the wallet with careful hands. My wife's name was Margaret, he said suddenly. She liked roses. Not red ones, yellow. Said red roses tried too hard. Ruby smiled a little. My mama likes flowers too, she said, but we don't buy them much. Arthur looked at Marla, and for the first time that night he seemed fully present. That is a shame, he said. Marla sat across from him, her mop bucket waiting near platform 7, her shift unfinished, her rent unpaid, her daughter up far too late on a school night. But Arthur Bell was safe. For the moment that had to be enough. 23 minutes later, a silver SUV pulled hard against the curb outside the terminal. A woman in a wool coat stepped out into the rain. Helen Bell did not look relieved when she came through the doors. She looked like a woman who had spent the whole drive imagining every terrible ending. Helen crossed the terminal floor with the sharp, controlled walk of a woman trying not to fall apart in public. She was in her late 40s, tall and pale with dark blonde hair pinned neatly at the back of her head. Her wool coat looked expensive but not showy. Rain clung to her shoulders in silver dots. In one hand she carried her car keys. In the other, her phone was still lit from the call. Her eyes found Arthur first. Dad. Arthur looked up from the bench. For a moment, his face filled with relief so open and childlike that Marla had to look away. Helen, he said, you came. Helen's mouth trembled, but she pressed it flat before the emotion could show. She knelt in front of him and touched his sleeve, then his shoulder, then his face, as if checking that every part of him had returned. What were you thinking? She whispered. Arthur looked embarrassed. I was going to Dayton. You were supposed to be at home. I thought Margaret. Helen closed her eyes. The name stood between them like a chair no one dared move. Marla turned slightly toward Ruby. Go sit by my bucket, baby. Keep your coat zipped. Ruby obeyed, though her eyes stayed fixed on Arthur. Helen stood. The worry on her face hardened as she turned toward Marla. You're the woman who called me? Yes, Mom. Marla Johnson. Helen's gaze moved over Marla's navy cleaning uniform, the plastic name tag, the worn shoes, the damp gloves tucked into one pocket. It was not a cruel look exactly, but it was a measuring one. A look that tried to decide a person's story before hearing her whole sentence. And you found his wallet, yes. Where? Near platform 7, under a bench. Helen held out her hand. May I see it? Arthur blinked. Helen, she gave it back. I just want to check, Dad. The words were quiet, but everyone understood them. Marla did not move. The terminal around them continued its tired midnight routine. A young man slept on his backpack near Gate 3. 2 nurses in blue scrubs bought coffee from the vending machine. An announcement crackled overhead, too distorted to understand. Marla looked at Helen's open hand. Then she looked at Arthur. The old man's face had fallen. Not because he doubted Marla, but because he understood that his mistake had pulled her into this humiliation. Slowly, Arthur handed the wallet to his daughter. Helen opened it with quick, nervous fingers. Cash, driver's license, Medicare card, receipts, photograph, folded note. She counted the bills. $47. Then she checked again. Marla stood still. She had learned a long time ago that when people expected you to defend yourself, silence could be the cleanest answer. But it was not painless. Silence had weight. It sat on her shoulders beside rent notices, grocery lists, and the tired fear of raising a child in a world that often inspected poor people more closely than it helped them. Ruby watched from beside the mop bucket. Her small face had changed. Children may not understand every adult word, but they understand when their mother is being judged. Helen looked up. Everything seems to be here. Marla gave a small nod. It is. Arthur's voice came softer than before. I told you. Helen flushed. Dad, I had to make sure. No, Arthur said, surprising them both. You wanted to make sure. Helen's eyes flickered with hurt. Marla stepped in before the moment broke open too far. "It's all right," she said. "You were scared." Helen looked at her, caught off guard by the mercy. Marla continued. "He was near gate 12 when they called final boarding for Columbus. I was afraid he might get on by mistake. So I asked him to sit down and called the number in the wallet." Helen's face lost some of its sharpness. "Columbus?" she said. "Yes, Mom." Helen turned back to Arthur. "Dad, I know," he said, though his voice made it clear he did not fully know. "I know." For the first time, Helen looked less angry than exhausted. She sat down beside him and covered her face with one hand. "I only left for 2 hours," she said. 2 hours. I put dinner in the refrigerator. I wrote the number on the table. I told Mrs. Carver next door to listen for the door, I thought. Her voice cracked. She stopped, ashamed of needing to cry in a public place. Arthur reached for her hand. "I was looking for your mother," he said. Helen's face broke. "She's gone, Dad. I know that most days," Arthur whispered. That sentence changed the air. Even Ruby went still. Marla felt her own heart fold around those words. She had seen many kinds of poverty in the terminal. Empty pockets, empty stomachs, empty eyes. But this was another kind entirely. A man standing at the border of his own memory, losing the roads inside himself, one familiar name at a time. Helen wiped her face quickly. "I'm sorry," she said, though Marla was not sure whether the apology was meant for Arthur, for herself, or for the woman she had just doubted. Marla nodded once. "You got here, that matters." Helen looked at Ruby then, as if noticing the child for the first time. "Is she yours?" "Yes." "Ruby." Ruby gave a small wave from beside the bucket. Helen's eyes softened. But only for a second. "It's late for a child to be here." Marla felt the words sting, even though they were true. "I know." "Is there no one who can watch her?" Arthur turned his head toward his daughter. "Helen." Marla lifted her chin, not with pride exactly, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had answered this question too many times. "I work 2 jobs," she said. "My neighbor watches her when she can. Tonight she couldn't. Ruby has her homework, her inhaler, and a safe chair where I can see her." Helen looked down. The judgment in her face shifted into something more complicated. Not understanding. Not yet. But perhaps the beginning of it. Arthur reached into his wallet and took out the photograph of Margaret. He held it toward Ruby. "My wife liked yellow roses," he said. Ruby came closer, careful and shy. "She's pretty," Ruby said. "She was," Arthur replied, "and she always knew when I was wrong before I did." Helen gave a small, broken laugh to spite herself. For one gentle second, the 4 of them were not a poor cleaner, a tired child, a confused old man, and a suspicious daughter. They were simply people gathered under bad fluorescent lights, each carrying a fear too heavy to explain. Then a supervisor's voice cut across the terminal. "Marla." She turned. Mr. Gaines, the night supervisor, stood near the ticket counter with a clipboard in his hand and irritation on his face. "Platform 7 still looks like a storm came through it," he said. "You getting paid to talk now?" Marla's shoulders tightened. Ruby stepped back. Helen looked at the mop bucket, then at Marla, then at the wet tracks still shining across the floor. Arthur slowly put the photograph back into his wallet, and Marla, who had returned every dollar, every card, every piece of Arthur Bell's life, reached for her mop as if nothing had happened. But Helen Bell was watching now, really watching. Marla did not answer Mr. Gaines. She had learned that some men wanted respect, and some wanted a reaction. Mr. Gaines usually wanted both. He was a narrow-shouldered man in his 50s with a gray mustache, tired eyes, and a clipboard he carried like a badge of authority. He was not the worst supervisor Marla had ever had. That was the kindest thing she could say about him. He did not shout unless there were witnesses. He did not insult people directly unless he could hide it inside a joke. But he kept a list in his mind of every employee who needed the job badly enough to stay quiet. Marla was near the top of that list. "Yes, sir," she said. "I'm finishing it now." Mr. Gaines looked from Marla to Helen, then to Arthur, then back to Marla. "This isn't a social club," he said. "We got passengers coming in at 1:15. I need that platform clean." Marla nodded. Ruby stood beside the mop bucket, her little hands folded around the strap of her backpack. Helen watched the child's face. Then she watched Marla dip the mop into gray water and press it through the wringer with practiced strength. "Excuse me," Helen said, stepping forward. Mr. Gaines turned with the mild surprise of a man who had not expected anyone in a wool coat to speak on Marla's behalf. "Yes? This woman just kept my father from boarding the wrong bus." Mr. Gaines glanced at Arthur. "That's so, yes," Helen said. "She found his wallet, returned everything inside, noticed he was confused, called me, and stayed with him until I arrived." Mr. Gaines gave a stiff little smile. "Well, That's nice, but she's still on the clock. Marla lowered her eyes. The worst part was that he was not wrong. She was on the clock. The floor was wet. Platform 7 was dirty. Bills did not care whether she had done the right thing. Neither did time cards. Helen opened her mouth, ready to say something sharper, but Arthur touched her sleeve. Let it be, he said softly. Helen looked at him. Dad, she has her dignity. Arthur said, don't spend it for her. The words settled over Marla with unexpected gentleness. She looked at Arthur. For a moment, his eyes were clear again, not wandering, not frightened, clear. Marla gave him a small nod, the kind people give when thank you is too thin a phrase for what passed between them. Mr. Gaines tapped his clipboard. Marla, yes, sir. She pushed the mop across platform 7. The water spread in long silver strokes beneath the fluorescent lights. Marla worked quickly, shoulders moving with the tired rhythm of someone who had measured half her life in hourly wages. She cleaned around muddy footprints, coffee spills, ticket stubs, and the sticky place where a child had dropped soda earlier that evening. Ruby returned to her chair behind the vending machines and opened her school folder. She was supposed to be practicing spelling words, but Marla knew her daughter's mind was still on the wallet. Helen helped Arthur into a seat near gate 6. She stayed beside him this time, holding his hand as if afraid he might drift away even while sitting still. For several minutes nobody spoke. Then Arthur looked toward Marla. She moves like Margaret did, he said. Helen followed his gaze. Who? Your mother. When we first bought the motel. He smiled faintly. She could clean 12 rooms before lunch and still make the lobby smell like lemons. Helen's expression softened. I remember the lemon smell. People thought she was just the woman behind the counter, Arthur said. But she knew every room, every repair, every guest who needed extra towels before they asked. His thumb moved slowly over the edge of his wallet. She used to say a building tells you what it needs if you stop walking through it like you own it. Helen looked back at Marla, who was scraping gum from beneath a bench with a small plastic blade. Arthur continued, that woman understands buildings too. Helen did not answer. But she was listening. Marla finished platform 7 at 1:07 a.m. She emptied the bucket, rinsed it, stacked the wet floor signs, and checked the restrooms near gate 2. Her back ached, her wrists burned from wringing the mop. When she finally returned to Ruby, her daughter was asleep in the plastic chair, one cheek pressed against her spelling folder. Marla stood still for a second, looking at her. Ruby's mouth was slightly open. Her breath came softly, but with the faint whistle Marla knew too well. She touched Ruby's forehead. No fever. Thank God. Helen approached quietly. Does she always come with you? Marla did not look up. No, only when I have no other choice. I didn't mean to judge. Marla gently zipped Ruby's coat higher. Most people don't mean to, they just do it before they notice. Helen absorbed that. Behind her, Arthur sat with both hands on his cane. He seemed smaller now, folded into himself by the long night. Helen said, I owe you an apology. Marla looked at her then. For checking the wallet like that, Helen continued. For the way I asked, for what I assumed. Marla wanted to say it was fine. Women like her were expected to make other people comfortable after being wounded. She had done it for landlords, customers, nurses at clinics, school office workers, and strangers who watched her too closely in grocery aisles. But tonight she was too tired to polish the truth. It wasn't fine, Marla said quietly, but I accept the apology. Helen's eyes dropped. That's fair. Marla lifted Ruby into her arms. The child stirred but did not wake. Ruby was getting too big to carry easily. But Marla still did it, because some nights a mother's arms were the only home she could promise. Arthur stood slowly. Miss Johnson, he said. Marla turned. He held the wallet against his chest. You returned more than this. Helen looked at him, startled by the steadiness in his voice. Arthur's eyes shone under the hard station lights. I knew I was lost, he said, but I could not find the courage to admit it to anyone. You let me be afraid without making me small. Marla swallowed. That's how I hoped someone would treat my mother, she said, if she were still here. Arthur nodded, as if he understood grief by its footsteps. Helen reached into her handbag and pulled out a business card. Marla stiffened. She knew what usually came next, a reward, a folded bill pressed into her hand. Charity offered quickly so the giver could drive home feeling less troubled. But Helen did not reach for cash. She held out the card. My number is on there, Helen said. If you ever need anything. Marla gave a tired smile. That's kind. But people say that when they're grateful at midnight. Helen did not pull the card back. I know, she said. So I'll say something more specific. My family owns an old roadside motel outside Lakewood. It's been closed since my mother died. Dad won't sell it. I've been trying to figure out what to do with it. Arthur looked up. Helen continued slowly, as if the idea was forming while she spoke. My mother always wanted part of it used for women who needed a safe place to start over. I never knew how to make that happen. Marla looked at the card, then at Helen. I clean bus stations, she said. Helen's voice grew softer. No, she said. You notice who might disappear. Marla did not know what to say. Ruby shifted in her arms and whispered in her sleep. Mama, I'm here, Marla said. Arthur smiled faintly. Outside, the rain had stopped. Beyond the glass doors, the streetlights shone on wet pavement, and Cleveland looked. For one brief hour before dawn, almost washed clean, Marla took the card. She did not know yet that the small white rectangle would sit on her kitchen table for 3 days. She did not know that she would almost throw it away twice. And she did not know that, by the end of the week, the old motel Arthur refused to sell would become the first real door her daughter had ever seen open. For 3 days, Helen Bell's business card sat on Marla Johnson's kitchen table. It lay beside a chipped blue mug, Ruby's spelling worksheet, 2 unpaid bills, and the yellow rent notice that had been folded so many times the paper was beginning to tear. Marla did not call. Every morning, she looked at the card while making oatmeal. Every night, after carrying Ruby home half asleep from the bus station, she looked at it again. Helen Bell, Bell Family Properties, Property Management. The words sounded too clean for Marla's life. They belonged to offices with glass doors, polished floors, and people who knew how to say proposal without feeling foolish. They did not belong in a small Cleveland apartment where the radiator knocked like an old man in the wall, where the stove took 3 tries to light, and where a mother counted coins before buying cough syrup. Ruby noticed the card too. Are you going to call the lady? She asked one morning. Marla placed a bowl of oatmeal in front of her. Eat before it gets cold. She said maybe she could help. Marla sat down across from her daughter. Maybe is not something you build a life on. Ruby stirred her oatmeal slowly. But maybe means we can knock, right? Marla looked at her child and felt something inside her ache. Ruby was only 6. But hardship had already taught her to listen for hope the way other children listened for music. That day, Marla worked 5 hours in the laundry room of a budget motel, folding sheets until her fingers smelled of bleach and hot cotton. By evening, she was back at the bus station in her navy cleaning uniform, with Ruby sitting behind the vending machines, her inhaler tucked safely inside her purple backpack. The terminal moved around them as it always did. Passengers arrived tired. Passengers left tired. People spilled coffee, dropped tickets, forgot phones, and walked past Marla as if clean floors appeared by mercy alone. Near Gate 2, Marla found a wedding ring beside the restroom sink. She turned it in. Mr. Gaines, her night supervisor, glanced at the envelope and gave a dry little laugh. You know, some folks would call that luck. Marla knew what he meant. The ring was small. Easy to hide, easy to sell. She picked up her mop. No, sir, she said. Some folks are just confused. Mr. Gaines leaned back in his chair. You're too honest for your own good. Marla looked toward Ruby, who was bent over her spelling homework with serious eyes. I'm honest for my daughter's good, she said. He had no answer for that. When their shift ended, Marla and Ruby rode the late bus home. Ruby slept against her mother's side, warm and heavy. Outside the window, Cleveland passed by in quiet pieces. Closed stores, gas stations, church signs, apartment windows glowing in the dark. At home, Marla carried Ruby upstairs. The yellow notice was still taped to the door. This time, someone had written 2 words beneath it in red ink. Final warning. Marla stood in the hallway with Ruby asleep on her shoulder and felt her strength go thin. Inside, she laid Ruby gently on the bed, checked her breathing, placed the inhaler nearby, and returned to the kitchen. The card was still there, so were the bills. Marla sat down and counted the money in her purse twice, as if numbers might change if a tired woman looked at them with enough hope. They did not. Rent, medicine, groceries, bus fare, electricity. There was never enough money to let every need survive. She picked up Helen's card, then put it down again. Pride had carried Marla through many hard years. Pride helped her return money she needed. Pride helped her stand straight when people looked through her. Pride helped her teach Ruby that poverty was not permission to lose yourself. But pride could become a locked door, too. Marla thought of Arthur Bell standing lost beneath the departure board. I knew I was lost. She had not judged him for needing help. So why was she judging herself? At 1:38 in the morning, Marla picked up the phone and dialed. Helen answered on the second ring. Marla? I'm sorry to call so late. Don't be. Marla looked toward Ruby's bedroom. You mentioned a motel, she said, and your mother wanting to help women. There was a quiet pause. Then Helen said, Can you come see it tomorrow? The next afternoon, Helen drove Marla and Ruby to Lakewood. Arthur came to, wearing his brown overcoat and navy scarf, his hands folded carefully over his cane. The old motel stood near a quiet road not far from the lake. The sign was faded, Belrose Motor Inn. Weeds grew through the cracks in the parking lot. Dust covered the office windows. One curtain hung crooked behind the glass. But along the front walkway, beneath the winterbear shrubs, Marla saw yellow rose bushes, cut back, thorny, waiting, still alive. Arthur looked at them with wet eyes. "Margaret planted those," he said. "She said people should see something kind before they asked for a room." Helen unlocked the office door. Inside, the air smelled of dust, old wood, and time. There was a front desk, brass room keys, a faded map of Ohio, and a guest book still open beneath the glass counter. Ruby held Marla's hand. "Mama, is this place broken?" Marla looked around, peeling paint. Worn carpet, water stains, a broken lamp. Then she looked again. Strong walls, wide rooms, doors that still locked, a laundry space in back. A small kitchen, a courtyard where children could play if someone cleared the weeds. Helen watched her. "What do you see?" Marla walked to the window and looked out at the rose bushes, waiting for spring. For the first time in a long while, she did not answer like an employee. She answered like a woman who understood survival. "I see 6 rooms that could be safe by summer," she said. "Maybe 8 if the plumbing holds." Arthur smiled. Helen grew very still. And Ruby whispered, "See, Mama, maybe means we can knock." Helen did not speak for a long moment. She stood in the dusty office of the Belrose Motor Inn, looking at Marla Johnson as if she had expected a polite answer and received a blueprint instead. Arthur sat slowly in the old chair behind the front desk. His hand rested on the row of brass room keys, each one hanging from a faded tag. Room 1, Room 2, Room 3. Names from another life. Ruby wandered no farther than Marla's hand could reach. She stared at the guest book beneath the glass counter, then at the old bell near the register. "Can I touch it?" she whispered. Marla looked at Helen. Helen smiled faintly. "Go ahead." Ruby pressed one small finger to the bell. Ding, the sound was clear, bright, and strangely alive. Arthur closed his eyes. "Margaret loved that bell," he said. "Said every ring meant somebody had made it through the road." Helen looked away quickly. Marla noticed. She noticed everything. That was the habit poverty gave a person. You learn to read silence, footsteps, locked doors, and the tone in someone's voice before the bad news arrived. Helen folded her arms. "The building has been empty for almost 4 years. I had 2 contractors look at it last spring. Both said the repairs would cost too much." Marla nodded. "Too much for a motel." Helen looked at her. "What do you mean?" Marla turned toward the hallway of rooms. "If you want paying guests, everything has to look perfect. New carpet, new signs, new furniture, fresh paint everywhere. But if you want safe rooms for mothers and children, perfect isn't the first thing." "What is?" "Locks," Marla said. "Heat, clean beds, working bathrooms, smoke detectors, a place to wash clothes, a kitchen that won't make anyone sick, and rules that protect people instead of shaming them." Arthur opened his eyes. Helen's expression changed. Not surprise exactly. Respect, maybe. Or the first careful shape of it. Marla continued, softer now. "A woman running from a bad night doesn't ask if the curtains match. She asks if the door closes." The office became quiet. Ruby looked up at her mother, not fully understanding, but understanding enough to stand closer. Helen swallowed. "You've thought about this?" Marla gave a small, tired smile. "No. I've lived close enough to it." Arthur touched one of the brass keys. "Margaret wanted this," he said. Helen turned to him. "Dad, Mom talked about it once or twice." "No," Arthur said. His voice was low but steady. "She talked about it for years. You were busy growing up. I was busy keeping accounts, but she talked." Helen's face tightened with old guilt. Arthur looked toward the rose bushes outside. "She said a motel was just a building where strangers slept. But it could become a place where people learned they were not strangers to God." Marla lowered her eyes. She was careful with religious words. She had heard people use them like blankets, and she had heard people use them like stones. But from Arthur, the sentence felt worn smooth by grief. Helen walked behind the counter and opened a drawer. Inside were old receipts, dry pens, rubber bands, and a small leather notebook. She picked it up. Arthur's face changed. "That was your mother's." Helen opened it carefully. The first few pages were filled with Margaret Bell's handwriting. Neat, slanted, patient. Helen read silently at first, then her voice broke as she spoke one line aloud. "Room 6 for women with children. No charge first 7 nights. Let them breathe before asking questions." Ruby turned to Marla. "What does that mean?" Marla brushed her thumb over Ruby's hand. "It means Mrs. Margaret was kind." Helen kept reading. There were notes about blankets, donated toys, Church volunteers, a pantry shelf, bus passes, and a small garden behind the office. It was not a fantasy. It was a plan, an old plan, waiting in a closed drawer while years passed over it like dust. Helen sat down slowly. I never knew she wrote this. Arthur looked at his daughter with sorrow, not blame. Your mother kept many things in drawers because I kept telling her we would talk later. The words landed hard. Helen closed the notebook. Outside, a cold wind moved through the rose bushes. Marla knew she should not feel hope yet. Hope could be expensive. Hope could ask for time she did not have, faith she could not spare, and trust she had learned to spend carefully. Still, something in that office had shifted. Helen looked at her. If we tried this, I would need someone practical. Someone who understands what the first families would actually need. Marla gave a short laugh before she could stop herself. Mrs. Bell, I clean floors and fold sheets, and you returned my father to me. That doesn't make me qualified. No, Helen said. But the way you saw this building does. Marla looked toward the hallway again. 6 rooms by summer. The phrase had come from her mouth like a guess. Now it stood in front of her like work, real work, difficult work, work that might fail. Ruby tugged her sleeve. Mama, could kids stay here? Maybe, Marla said. Kids like me? Marla's throat tightened. Before she could answer, Helen's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her face changed. What is it? Arthur asked. Helen hesitated. It's my brother. Arthur's expression dimmed. David? Helen nodded. Marla saw the tension immediately. Helen stepped aside to answer. Her voice lowered, but the office was too quiet not to hear pieces of the call. No, I'm at the motel. Yes, with Dad. Because he wanted to come. David, we are not selling it this week. I know what the offer says. No, I don't care if the developer is waiting. Arthur's hand curled around the brass key. Marla looked at him. He looked suddenly tired, as if the building itself had been placed on his chest. Helen ended the call and turned back slowly. My brother wants to sell, she said. Arthur shook his head. No, Dad. No, he repeated, stronger this time. Not Margaret's roses. Helen pressed her lips together. Marla knew that look too. Family trouble, money trouble, legal trouble. The kind that entered a room quietly and took every chair. She reached for Ruby's backpack. We should go. Helen looked at her. Please don't. Marla paused. Helen held Margaret's notebook against her chest. I don't know if I can stop the sale, she said, but I want to try, and if I try, I need the truth. Not a dream, not charity, the truth. Marla looked at the dusty office, the keys, the old guest book, the little bell Ruby had rung, and the rose bushes waiting outside like promises that had survived winter. Then she looked at Ruby. Her daughter was watching her with the dangerous hope of a child who still believed doors opened when good people pushed hard enough. Marla took a breath. The truth, she said. Helen nodded. Marla set Ruby's backpack down again. The truth is, this place won't save anybody just because your mother wanted it to. It needs money, rules, repairs, inspections, and people who won't quit when it gets ugly. Helen listened. Marla continued, but if you can keep the building, I can help you make a list. Room by room, need by need, no pretending. Arthur smiled faintly. Helen opened Margaret's notebook to a blank page and handed Marla a pen. Marla stared at it. For years she had signed forms other people gave her. Timesheets, rent notices, school papers, clinic documents. This was different. This was a blank page asking for her own hand. Slowly, Marla wrote at the top, 6 rooms by summer. Ruby leaned against her side. Arthur touched the bell once. Ding, and for the first time the sound did not feel like memory, it felt like beginning. David Bell arrived the next morning in a black sedan that looked too polished for the cracked parking lot of the Bell Rose Motor Inn. Marla saw him first. She had come early with Ruby's purple backpack over one shoulder and Margaret Bell's old notebook tucked carefully under her arm. Helen had offered to pay her for a few afternoon hours each week, not as charity but as consulting work. Marla had not quit either of her jobs. Not yet. She still folded sheets in the morning and cleaned the bus station at night. But in the narrow hours between survival and sleep, she had begun helping Belle Rose breathe again. All night the words had followed her. 6 rooms by summer now, standing in the dusty office, with Arthur seated behind the front desk, and Helen speaking to a city inspector on the phone. Those words felt less like hope and more like a promise that could break in her hands. David stepped inside without ringing the bell. He was tall, white in his early 50s, with a charcoal coat, leather gloves, and Arthur's pale blue eyes without Arthur's softness. His gaze moved across the office, stopping briefly on Ruby, then on Marla's navy cleaning jacket. "What is this?" he asked. Helen ended her call. "Good morning, David. Dad shouldn't be here." Arthur straightened in the old chair. "This is my motel." David's jaw tightened. "It was your motel." Now it is an empty building costing this family money every month. It is not empty, Arthur said quietly. David looked around at the dust. The faded map, the brass keys, the cracked floor. Really, Ruby moved closer to Marla. Helen stepped forward. We're discussing another option. David gave a short laugh. Another option? The developer's offer expires Friday. Cash purchase. No delays. No more taxes. No more insurance. No more repair bills. Arthur placed one trembling hand on Margaret's notebook. Your mother did not want it sold. David's face hardened. Mom wanted many things before she got sick. The words struck the room like cold rain. Helen's voice lowered. That was cruel. David looked away, but only for a second. What's cruel is pretending we can rebuild the past with a broken motel and a stranger. His eyes turned to Marla. And who are you? Marla lifted her chin. Marla Johnson. She found Dad at the bus station, Helen said. David looked her over again. You're the cleaner. I clean for a living, Marla said. Yes. And now you're advising my family on property. The insult was quiet. But Ruby understood enough to grip her mother's hand. Marla did not raise her voice. No, sir, she said. I'm telling the truth. David paused. Marla looked down the hallway toward the first 6 rooms. This place is not ready. It needs heat, locks, plumbing, smoke detectors, clean beds, safe exits, and rules that protect people. A good heart won't fix a bad roof. Helen looked worried, as if Marla had just helped David win. But Marla continued. Still, selling it won't answer the need. It will only turn this building into somebody else's profit. Arthur's eyes filled. Marla looked at David now. I don't know your debts. I don't know your family grief. But I know what it means to be one bad week from nowhere. A safe room is not a small thing. For the first time, David had no quick answer. Just then, a white city vehicle pulled into the lot. Mr. Collins, the building inspector, stepped out with a gray beard, a clipboard, and the tired expression of a man used to disappointing, hopeful people. The inspection took almost 2 hours. They walked through the rooms one by one. Marla pointed out rusted locks, damp corners, weak windows, blocked exits, and places where children could get hurt. She did not pretend. She did not soften the damage. David watched her with a different look now. Not kind, but listening. At last, Mr. Collins closed his clipboard. The structure is better than I expected, he said, but it is not ready for families. Helen's face fell. David folded his arms. Mr. Collins continued. However, if you limit the first phase to the front 6 rooms, repair the heat, update detectors, clear the rear exit, and fix the plumbing in rooms 2 and 5, there may be a path. Helen looked up. A path? A narrow one, he said. But yes. Arthur closed his eyes. Helen turned to David. Give me 30 days. No, 30 days. The offer expires Friday. Then let it expire. David stared at her. Before he could answer, Ruby's small voice came from beside the front desk. Mr. David? Everyone turned. Ruby pointed to Margaret's notebook, which had fallen open beneath Arthur's hand. There's writing about you. David frowned. About me? Arthur lowered his eyes to the page. Helen leaned closer and read the line softly. David notices broken things one day. I hope he learns that people can be repaired too. The room became very still. David looked at the notebook. For the first time, something in his face lost its armor. He reached for the page, but stopped before touching it. That's my mother's handwriting, he said. Arthur nodded. She knew you. David swallowed. For a long moment, he said nothing. The offer, the taxes, the insurance, the developer waiting outside the family's grief. All of it remained true. But so did that sentence in Margaret's careful hand. At last, David picked up his gloves. 30 days, he said. Not because I believe in this. Because I am tired of being the only villain in a family full of ghosts. Then he walked out. The sedan disappeared down the road. For a moment, no one moved. Then Ruby reached up and rang the little front desk bell. Ding! Helen laughed through tears. Marla opened the notebook and wrote beneath the title, Day 1. Outside, the rose bushes stood bare in the cold, but somewhere inside their thorns, spring had already begun. By Monday morning, the Belle Rose Motor Inn no longer felt abandoned. It still looked tired. The paint still peeled near the office door. The parking lot still had weeds pushing through the cracks. Room 2 still smelled faintly of damp carpet, and the heater in room 5 made a sound like a train trying to climb a hill. But something had changed. People had begun to enter the building with purpose. Helen arrived with folders, coffee, and a list of licensed repairmen. Arthur came with his brown overcoat and navy scarf, carrying Margaret's notebook like a sacred thing. Marla came after her laundry shift, still smelling faintly of bleach, with Ruby beside her and a pencil tucked behind one ear. They started with the front 6 rooms. Marla insisted on walking through each one slowly. No guessing, she said. Guessing gets people hurt. Helen wrote everything down. Room 1 needed a new lock, fresh bedding, and a smoke detector. Room 2 needed plumbing work before anyone could stay there. Room 3 had the best light, the strongest door, and enough space for a mother with 2 children. Room 4 needed paint, but the bathroom worked. Room 5 needed the heater checked. Room 6 had a water stain on the ceiling, but the window faced the rose bushes. Ruby chose room 6 as her favorite. "It looks sad," she said, standing in the doorway, "but maybe we can make it better." Arthur smiled at that. "Your mother used to say buildings had moods," he told Helen. Helen looked toward Marla. "I'm beginning to believe her." Marla lowered her eyes, but she could not hide the small warmth that crossed her face. By the end of the week, volunteers began to come. A retired plumber from Helen's church, 2 nursing students with strong arms and bright laughter, an old woman named Mrs. Carver, Arthur's neighbor, who brought sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and said she had been waiting years for someone to open those curtains again. Marla gave everyone jobs. Not because she wanted control, but because she knew chaos could ruin good intentions. "Trash first," she said, "then safety, then cleaning. Pretty comes last." Some people smiled at the way she spoke, direct and calm, but by the second day they were listening. Helen listened most of all. She watched Marla test every window lock twice. She watched her kneel to check outlets at Ruby's eye level. She watched her move broken furniture away from exits before anyone else noticed the danger. Once, Helen said quietly, "You should have been managing something long before now." Marla did not stop sweeping. "Maybe I was, just not where people could see it." That answer stayed with Helen. On Friday afternoon, David returned. He did not come inside at first. He stood in the parking lot, looking at the open doors, the trash bags, the cleaned windows, the small line of donated blankets folded on the office counter. Marla saw him from room 3. Ruby was helping Arthur sort brass keys by number at the front desk. Helen went outside to meet her brother. Marla could not hear every word, but she saw enough. David's crossed arms, Helen's tired face. The way both of them looked toward Arthur when he laughed softly at something, Ruby said. Finally, David came in. The office went quiet. He looked around for a long moment. "This doesn't make it financially smart," he said. Helen sighed. "I know." David looked at Marla. "And it doesn't mean the city will approve anything." "I know that too," Marla said. He seemed almost disappointed that she gave him nothing to argue with. Then his eyes fell on the row of brass keys. Arthur had polished them. Old metal. New shine. David picked up the key to room 1. His face changed. "I used to sleep in this room when Mom and Dad had guests in the house," he said. Arthur looked up. "You said the vending machine outside scared you." David gave a small, unwilling smile. "It made noises at night." "So did you," Arthur said. For one fragile second, the old family returned. Then David placed the key back on the counter. "I made some calls," he said. Helen went still. David kept his eyes on the keys. "A contractor I know owes me a favor. He can look at the heating system Monday." No promises. Helen's eyes filled, but she did not move toward him. "Thank you," she said. David nodded once, as if accepting more than gratitude would cost too much. The first room to be finished was room 1. It was not beautiful in the way magazines understood beauty. The floor still creaked near the bathroom door. The dresser had one handle that did not match the others. The curtains were simple yellow cotton, donated by Mrs. Carver from a box she had kept in her attic for 12 years. But the lock worked. The heater worked. The smoke detector blinked red above the door. The sheets were clean, the towels were folded, and on the small table by the window sat a glass jar with 3 yellow roses from the bushes Margaret Belle had planted long ago. Ruby stood in the doorway holding Marla's hand. "It looks safe," she whispered. Marla looked at the bed, the lamp, the clean bathroom, the window that faced the courtyard. Safe. It was a small word, but to some people it was larger than a house. Helen came in behind them with a folder pressed to her chest. "The city review is tomorrow morning." Marla nodded. Arthur, seated in the hallway with his cane across his knees, looked up. Margaret always said the first room mattered most. Helen smiled sadly. "What did she say about the second room?" Arthur thought for a moment. Then his face clouded. "I don't remember." The silence that followed was gentle, but painful. Helen knelt beside him. "That's all right, Dad." Arthur looked ashamed. "I should remember." Marla stepped closer. "Maybe room 1 remembered for you." Arthur lifted his eyes to her. Then he smiled. The next morning, 2 city officials arrived at 10 o'clock. One was Mr. Collins, the inspector who had already walked the building. The other was a woman named Ms. Ramirez from Community Housing Services. She wore a gray suit, sensible shoes, and the careful expression of someone who had seen too many good intentions fail under poor planning. David came too. He stood near the office door. arms folded, saying little. Marla had dressed carefully in a clean cream blouse, dark slacks, and the same worn black shoes she used for church and school meetings. Her hair was pinned back neatly. Ruby sat behind the front desk with a coloring book, quiet as a mouse. Helen began the presentation. She explained the building, the repairs, the family history, Margaret's notebook, and the proposed short-stay program for mothers with children. Ms. Ramirez listened, but her questions were sharp. Who screens applicants? Helen answered. What happens after 7 nights? Helen glanced at Marla. Marla stepped forward. We do not promise what we cannot provide, she said. 7 nights is breathing room, not a full rescue. Every family gets a written plan on day 1, housing contacts, clinic referrals, food support, transportation options, and a follow-up person, Ms. Ramirez looked at her. And who are you in this project? For a second, the old answer rose in Marla's throat. I clean floors. But Ruby was watching. Arthur was watching. Helen was watching. Marla stood straighter. I am the operations coordinator, she said. The title sounded strange in her mouth. But not false. Miss Ramirez studied her. What qualifies you? David looked down. Helen held her breath. Marla did not. I know what families notice first, she said. A mother checks the lock before she checks the pillow. She counts exits before she unpacks. She wants to know if her child can sleep without being watched by strangers. She wants rules but not shame, help but not pity. The room went quiet. Marla continued, I have lived close enough to that fear to respect it, and I have cleaned enough rooms to know when a place is truly ready for someone to rest. Miss Ramirez's face softened just slightly. Mr. Collins cleared his throat. Room 1 passes. If the rest are brought to the same standard, I see no safety objection to a limited pilot. Helen closed her eyes in relief, but Ms. Ramirez raised one hand. A safety pass is not program approval. The hope in the office tightened. Miss Ramirez looked at Marla again. However, I will recommend a 30-day provisional partnership. 1 room first, 1 family. No more until reporting is reviewed. 1 room? David asked. 1 room, Miss Ramirez said. If you want this to last, start where you can keep your promise. Arthur whispered, room 1. That afternoon, Helen received the call. A mother and her 8-year-old son needed emergency placement for 3 nights. Their apartment building had been declared unsafe after a fire. No injuries, but nowhere to go. Marla prepared room 1 herself. She checked the lock twice. She placed fresh towels on the bed. Ruby set a small box of crayons on the table. At dusk, the mother arrived. She was young, pale with exhaustion, holding a grocery bag of clothes in one hand and her son's shoulder with the other. The boy's eyes were too tired for his age. Marla met them at the office door. Welcome, she said softly. You're safe tonight. The woman's mouth trembled, not because the room was perfect, because someone had said the words before she had to ask. Arthur rang the little bell. Ding, Helen wiped her eyes. David turned toward the window and Marla handed over the first key. By spring, the yellow roses had begun to bloom. They did not bloom all at once. First came small green leaves along the thorny stems. Then tight buds appeared, shy and stubborn against the cold mornings. Finally, one by one, the roses opened beside the walkway of the Bell Rose Motor Inn. Bright as little lamps, room 1 had become more than a room. It had held a mother and son after a fire. A grandmother with 2 grandchildren after a landlord changed the locks. A young woman who needed 3 nights to make 3 phone calls that would change her life. No one stayed forever. That was never the promise. The promise was smaller. Tonight, you are safe. And sometimes, smaller promises were the ones people trusted most. Marla Johnson kept a notebook at the front desk now. Not Margaret's notebook, her own. In it, she wrote everything. Who needed bus passes? Which rooms needed repairs? Which child liked oatmeal? Which mother was too proud to ask for diapers until Ruby quietly placed them beside the door? Which volunteer forgot to lock the supply closet? Which heater made noise when the wind came off the lake? Helen called her the operations coordinator. David called her practical. Arthur called her something else. The woman who brought me home. He said it so often that Ruby began to smile whenever she heard it. Arthur's memory still came and went. Some days he knew exactly where he was. Other days he stood beneath the motel sign and asked whether Margaret had checked in the guests. On those days, Marla never corrected him too sharply. She left us good instructions, Marla would say, and Arthur would nod, comforted by that. David did not become a different man overnight. People rarely do, but he came every Saturday now, usually claiming he only wanted to check the accounts. Then he would fix a cabinet hinge, carry donations, or stand quietly in room 6, where the water stain had finally been painted over. One afternoon, Marla found him planting 2 new yellow rose bushes near the office steps. He did not look up when she approached. "Mom would complain the spacing is wrong," he said. Marla smiled. "Then you'd better do it right." He gave a small laugh. It was the first easy sound she had ever heard from him. The Belle Rose program remained modest. 6 rooms by summer had become 4 approved rooms by spring, with 2 more waiting on plumbing funds. Ms. Ramirez visited twice as a month, Mr. Collins still carried his clipboard like a judge. The paperwork was heavy, the money was never enough, but the doors opened. That mattered. On a clear Sunday afternoon, Helen invited volunteers, neighbors, city workers, and former guests to a small dedication in the courtyard. Nothing fancy. Folding chairs, lemonade, a table of sandwiches, Ruby in a yellow dress proudly handing out paper cups. Marla stood near the back at first. Old habits were hard to break. She was used to serving, cleaning, watching from the edge. Then Helen called her name. "Marla," she said. "Will you come up here?" Marla froze. Ruby took her hand. "Go, Mama." So Marla walked to the front. Helen stood beside Arthur beneath the motel sign. David stood on the other side, holding Margaret's notebook. The yellow roses moved gently in the spring air. Helen's voice trembled as she spoke. "My mother dreamed of this place before any of us had the courage to understand it. My father protected that dream, even when memory made the world difficult. My brother helped keep the doors open when selling would have been easier." She turned to Marla. "But this woman taught us what the dream actually meant." Marla lowered her eyes. Helen continued. "She taught us that charity without respect is only another locked door. She taught us that a safe room is not small. She taught us that dignity must be part of every policy, every form, every rule, and every welcome." The courtyard grew quiet. Arthur reached for Marla's hand. "She returned my wallet," he said softly. Then he looked at the crowd. "No," he corrected himself. "She returned me." Marla could not stop the tears then. She did not sob. She simply stood there as the life she had carried alone for so long was finally witnessed by others. Ruby wrapped both arms around her waist. After the dedication, Ms. Ramirez asked Marla to speak at a city meeting the following month. Not as a charity case, not as a cleaner someone had discovered, but as the woman who helped design a program that kept mothers and children from disappearing between systems. Marla almost said no. Then she looked at Ruby, and she said yes. That evening, after everyone left, Marla stayed to sweep the office floor. Helen laughed when she saw her. "You know we have volunteers for that now." Marla looked down at the broom in her hands. "I know," she said, "but I like leaving a place ready for morning." Outside, Arthur sat on the bench beside the roses. Ruby sat next to him, reading aloud from her school book. David locked the storage shed. Helen turned off the courtyard lights one by one. Marla stepped to the office door and looked at the motel. 4 rooms ready, 2 rooms waiting. A notebook full of names, a row of brass keys, a bell that still rang clear. Her life was not suddenly easy. The bills did not vanish. Ruby still needed medicine. Marla still worked harder than most people ever saw. But something had changed. She was no longer only surviving inside other people's buildings. She was helping build a doorway for others. Ruby looked up from the bench. "Mama?" "Yes, baby. Are we home?" Marla looked at Arthur, at Helen, at David, at the yellow roses shining softly in the dusk. Then she smiled. "We're getting there," she said, and from the front desk, the little bell caught the evening wind. Ding.